informed police responses to children exposed to violence, training, and tools. This webinar is brought to you by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. My name is William Moore, and I am with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be published on INTAC's YouTube page. The webinar recording will be archived and on the National Training and Technical Assistance Center's YouTube channel, where you can also view past webinars. For the event transcript and other supporting materials, please contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. To download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here you'll also find an FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions. Click on the file name and then click the download button. During today's webinar, presenters will address questions during our Q&A segment. Please type in your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a few minutes to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people that are in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything at this time. And I'll give folks a few seconds to do that. Again, please type in the number of additional people that are with you in the room today. If you're viewing by yourself, there's no need to type anything at this time. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of today's event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Please note that only participants that are registered and signed in will receive a certificate of attendance. And lastly, at the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a brief link for a brief evaluation. This feedback that you provide will help assist us in future planning and training. And now we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. I will now turn over today's webinar to Tiffany Garner. Thank you for joining.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, or IACP, in collaboration with the United States Department of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and Yale Child Study Center, welcome to today's webinar entitled Building Trauma-Informed Police Responses to Children Exposed to Violence, Training and Tools. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. We have Luis Casanova, Assistant Chief of the New Haven Police Department, and we have Dr. Stephen Marin, Director of the Childhood Violence Trauma Center at Yale School of Medicine. I will share a little bit about their bios. So first, we'll start with Luis Casanova. He's currently the Assistant Chief at the New Haven Police Department. Assistant Chief Casanova began his career in the Department of Corrections, then he joined the New Haven Police Department in 1996. Prior to his current position, Assistant Chief Casanova oversaw the Patrol Bureau, where he was responsible for all uniformed officers, managing officers working in the Patrol Division, Animal Shelter, SWAT, Emergency Services, and Hospice Negotiation. Working comfortably at the intersection of theory and practice, Assistant Chief Casanova has been a long-time champion of New Haven's child development community policing programs and has also served as a consultant to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, collaborating with the Yale Child Study Center to develop a toolkit to enhance law enforcement to respond to children exposed to violence. Our next presenter was Dr. Stephen Marin, and let me share his bio with you. He is the Director of the Childhood Violent Trauma Center at the Yale Child Study Center and the Harris Professor of Child Psychoanalysis and Professor of Psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. He is founder of the Child Development Community Policing CDCP program, a model for police mental health collaborative responses to traumatic events that has been replicated and served as a model for similar programs in communities around the United States and abroad. Dr. Mehrens is also co-developer of the Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention, it's CSTSI, the only evidence-based early trauma-focused intervention for children and families that interrupts and prevents the development of PTSD and related disorders. He is also the co-developer of a nationally disseminated toolkit on trauma-informed policing. He has responded to various mass casualty disasters around the country, including the attack on 9/11 and the Sandy Hook shooting. Over the years, Dr. Mehrens has provided consultation to the White House, members of Congress, Attorney General's Office, U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and other federal agencies on issues related to children's exposure to violence and interventions to reduce the traumatic impact of violence. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Mehrens to begin our presentation.
So to begin with, we're going to start by talking about really the scope of the problem of children exposed to violence. And some of you, or many of you, may be familiar with the National Survey of Children Exposed to Violence, a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Justice and colleagues at University of New Hampshire, amongst others. And it's really quite stunning when we realize that just in the last year, 1 in 3 children report having been physically assaulted. 5% of children reported being sexually victimized within the previous year. 15% suffered some form of maltreatment. Nearly 1 in 4 children reported witnessing violence in their homes, schools, and communities. Almost 1 in 10 children reported seeing a family member assault another. These are really quite staggering numbers. It's especially important to realize that there are implications of this exposure. For example, children exposed to domestic violence are 158% more likely to be victimized by violence themselves than counterparts from nonviolent households. The risk was 115% higher for boys, and perhaps not surprisingly, 229% higher for girls. We also know that exposure to violence in early childhood is associated with higher risk for physical aggression, delinquency, and violent behavior in adolescence. And again, not so surprising, traumatic childhood events have been documented, and we're talking significant traumatic events, been documented in the histories of nearly 99% of juvenile delinquents. More than 70% of adolescents receiving treatment for substance abuse had significant histories of trauma exposure, and almost 50% of teen mothers report childhood sexual abuse. When we think about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, we see that the more ACEs, adverse experiences that the child has, the greater the likelihood of increased risk for longer-term health problems. So when we think about trauma, which is often an overused term, we're actually talking about an experience that's unlike any other. This is not just about being anxious. This is actually psychological trauma, as seen as an injury, occurs when there's an overwhelming, unanticipated danger that leads to the experience of helplessness and the reality of loss of control and what we call terror. We know that in these circumstances, there's an immobilization of our usual typical methods of decreasing danger and anxiety, that is, fight or flight. In fact, what we see in a traumatic situation is freezing, immobilization. And we know actually a great deal about the neurophysiologic dysregulation that compromises the way we're able to feel, think, and act in response to the world around us. So when we think about the brain and the particular characteristics in the traumatic situation, I wanted to just point out two areas. You'll see the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And we know that in normal circumstances, the prefrontal cortex helps to actually control the activities of the amygdala, which we think of as the site of our emotional responses, the chemistry of our emotions. And we know that in turn, when there is an impact from our emotional center, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex helps to sort things out, to keep things ordered, so that we're able to think straight even when there's an increased amount of distress. All one needs to think about is getting ready to go away on vacation and feeling both excited and a little worried that you're going to forget something, and sitting back or sitting down and making a list. And immediately when we have that list in front of us, we feel in better control, especially when we're able to check off the items on the list. Imagine what happens in the traumatic situation where this conversation between the decision-making part of our brain and the emotional part of our brain is disconnected. This is what occurs in a traumatic situation, in which our ability to think, order, and organize our experiences is disconnected from the emotional center. There is a kind of flooding that then disables our ability to organize our thinking, our perceptions, and severely compromise our plans of action and reaction. We know that without recognition, support, and treatment, early traumatic reactions can persist and result in long-term negative outcomes. And these can lead to a variety of emotional, behavioral, social, and psychiatric consequences. They include attachments and relationship problems, PTSD, school failure, suicidal behaviors, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, not surprisingly substance abuse that often follows these as an attempt to self-medicate to reduce the experiences of overwhelming ongoing distress. We know that the long-term consequences can include turning from the passive victim of exposure to violence into becoming an active perpetrator of violent and abusive behaviors. We also know, as we suggested earlier, that untreated, unrecognized traumatic reactions can lead to long-term chronic health issues as well, and to personality disorders that actually limit who we can become as we move forward in our development. We also know that there are phases of traumatic reactions. Trauma is not just one thing, that in fact our trauma reactions are divided into immediate acute responses from within moments to the first 24 or 48 hours of a traumatic event, peritraumatic phase event, symptoms that can occur up to 3 months after the original traumatic event, and then chronic PTSD and related disorders that occur and set in after 3 months, 2 to 3 months after the original event. And there's also what can sometimes occur, which is a delayed onset, where someone seems to be doing well and then 6 months later develops really quite significant symptomatology that interferes with their functioning, their happiness, and their abilities to feel in charge of themselves. Now, we know that there are risk and protective factors that determine the outcome of our traumatic experiences. And they are the failure to recognize post-traumatic distress and the absence of social and family support. In other words, in the absence of the recognition of post-traumatic distress by others, in the absence of social and family support, children who are exposed to potentially traumatic events are at greatest risk for failures of recovery.
All right. What we've learned in New Haven throughout the years is that we were going to the same homes over and over again for the same types of issues, children exposed to violence or witnessing violence. And what we learned is that we have the ability to train our officers to properly identify when a child is exposed to violence. Right? We're not asking them to be clinicians. We're asking them to during a hostile, volatile situation, how to intervene and how to engage a kid early on and direct the kid to the proper resources early on in order for us not to return to these homes and in order for the child to get the proper treatment early on and not allow these experiences to be ignored.
So one of the things that we could add is that going back to the sheer numbers, which we all may be overwhelmed by, the more we know about the phenomena of unrecognized, untreated trauma, the better position we're in to recognize where we can intervene. And so what Chief Casanova was just referring to is that police not only become a resource for making referrals, but in their response, their trained and supported response to children and families, they often play the most critical role in actually being the eyes and ears, the picture of authority that actually pays attention to what is going on for the victims of the events to which police are responding. And so we have an opportunity to actually change the math of outcomes, that instead of failures of recovery, with early identification, early intervention, and support for recovery, we have a greater likelihood that children and families who are at greatest risk for both the short-term suffering and longer-term negative outcomes, we have an alternative, and that is the possibility for recovery.
And how police officers are protective factors. We were instrumental in reestablishing order through calm, authoritative, purposeful presence and actions. You're going to jump in?
And again, I think that often officers use their authority in all sorts of ways all the time. And it's why often over the many years that we've worked together, when Chief Casanova talks about what the clinicians bring, we always get into an argument, a friendly argument, about the essential role that police play in stepping in when prefrontal cortex activities are compromised. In fact, as authorities, police are in the best position to offer an organizing function that for any of us who've been through a traumatic experience knows is not available when we're most overwhelmed by the events to which police are required to respond. And so when we think about the idea of how do we help our police colleagues actually take on another aspect to enhance their roles as law enforcement professionals, we worked and developed over the basis of over 25 years of our work in New Haven and elsewhere in our partnership. We took what we've learned about the essential role and critical role that police can offer in the development of the enhancing law enforcement capacities to respond to children exposed to violence. The toolkit was developed in collaboration between Yale and the International Association of Chiefs of Police and funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, and was actually developed by police members in the New Haven Department of Police Service, our partners in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, as well as the Mecklenburg County Mental Health Services, along with colleagues here at the Yale Child Study Center. So what we've done is we've actually created tools designed to have the greatest utility in the field. And putting this simply, to actually take advantage of what we've learned and combine it with what is known from our partners in the IACP about law enforcement training and the breadth of IACP developed venues for review and dissemination of principles and practices that we've learned about in the field, that we've learned about in terms of not asking officers to do more than they're trained for, but to actually equip officers to respond to the kids and families to whom they are dealing with every single day, but also giving them the tools so that they no longer have to walk away with blinders on, feeling that there was nothing they had to offer to the kids and families who they leave behind after responding to events of violence and other catastrophic circumstances. And so the toolkit actually involves an organizational assessment and action plan for law enforcement agencies, guidelines, and this is actually used as a self-assessment for departments to take a look at what they're already doing to address the needs of children and families exposed to violence. Guidelines for police executives that actually serves as a briefing so that police executives can be more informed about the impact of exposure to violence on children and the roles that police can play in mitigating, decreasing those impacts, as well as publications that have occurred, that have been printed by the IACP and Police Chief and Tactical Edge magazines on some of the experiences that we've had over many years. And we've also developed a classroom training based on the toolkit entitled Protecting and Serving. But for the purposes of this webinar, we wanted to give you a sense of what is in the toolkit intended for frontline officers who respond often on their own to children and families exposed to violence. And of these include an on-scene acute protocol. What do you actually do and say when you're first arriving on the scene, in addition to securing safety and the immediate provisions of traditional police responses? What are some of the special considerations that officers need to keep in mind when they're thinking about responding specifically to domestic violence? What kind of equipment, what preparation should officers have when they're involved in doing death notifications, often one of the hardest tasks for officers to actually carry out? And also to take advantage of other materials based on children arrested parents model, as well as the roll call training video that has been developed by our partners at the IACP. In addition, these toolkit modules help to identify traumatic stress reactions on the scene. We have been so impressed often with both an understandable wish and what officers often see when children are sitting in front of a television after just witnessing a brutal fight and perhaps potential beating of one of their parents perpetrated against the other, sitting watching TV, and the officers wind up feeling that the kids are doing okay, that they're not crying. Well, we've actually learned a great deal by being on the scene with our police colleagues about the various signs and symptoms of distress that children and adults show when police officers are responding to violent events. Also, how do you think about kids not just in one full stroke, but how do we think about kids' responses to police at different ages, different phases in their development, and how can we help police respond to children of different ages when they're responding to scenes of violence? We also think about how to help officers respond to questions commonly asked by kids and common issues with caregivers to identify police responses to them. We also teach officers how to teach both kids and adults on violent scenes acutely a breathing technique that we call calm breathing or tactical breathing that can help actually turn the volume down on the immediate out of control levels of distress that both kids and adults may be experiencing and which officers are often confronting when they arrive on scene. And we also include a brochure for parents and caregivers, helping them to be better equipped in recognizing some of the signs and symptoms of their children when they have witnessed violence in the home or in their neighborhoods or at school. Now I will turn it over to you, Tiffany.
Yes, all right. Thank you so much. We appreciate you all's information. And so let's take some questions from the audience. We're opening up, and if you all can just submit some questions in the chat box, questions you have for Luis or Dr. Marin, that would be great at this time. We did have a question earlier on, will this PowerPoint be available? And I think someone had already responded, but I did want to let you all know the PowerPoint is available in the handout box. For you guys to see a handouts box on your screen, you guys can download all of those items for your use. So we open up for any additional questions. So we have a question from Ms. Robbins. How are we able to get this toolkit?
So the best way to get access is you can actually go to the IACP website where it is available online. Tiffany, you may want to add to that, but
yeah, absolutely. So if you all can email at cev@viacp.org, and then just let us know that you are interested in the toolkit, and we'll get those to you all. We have another question from Judy Henderson. Are all the standalone tools on your website?
It's on IACP's website, yes.
Yes. So it's the same. So the same thing. So if you all can go to email us, cv@iacp.org, and we can get you that information, and we'll send you the link to where you can find all those tools.
They're all part of the
Kathy Lambert.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Mary.
No, I was just going to say all of the modules are part of the toolkit that you'll find online.
Yes, absolutely. And Kathy Lambert says, what is the website also that you have behind you? And I take it you're talking about behind me. That's the IACP.org. And that's the organization that we obviously have helped put together the toolkit. So that's what's listed behind me. I know my body's cutting off half of that, but that's what that is. Okay, we have another question here. What are some practical, tangible things we can share with children? Let's see here. Wait a minute. To help them process a traumatic event.
Well, I think that the first thing, it's a great question. And I want to just share a very brief story about one of the first responses over 25 years ago that I did with a colleague. Then he was a sergeant in the New Haven Police Department. And we've been called to the scene of a shooting. This was a former boyfriend of a young woman who had crashed through sliding glass doors and chased her and her 18-month-old into an adjoining apartment where she and her son cowered in a closet, and the assailant then shot and killed the woman and wounded the 18-month-old in front of a woman and her 12, 13-year-old son. And I realized that when my colleague, Sergeant Marr, and I arrived on the scene, the investigating officer and the scene commander walked us through, and they said, well, let us show you what everyone saw, what the kids saw. And it would take a while for me to learn that what the officers were telling me was, let us show you what we saw. Let us show you the horrors that we are aware of occurring to the family to whom we are responding. And I think that it's really important for all and any responding serving officer, sworn officer knows about are the innumerable scenes where what they confront is chaos and disorder, and once they have fulfilled their task of securing the scene, they may see a variety of things that is actually behavioral presentations of traumatic distress and dysregulation. So the first order of business is actually being able to pay attention and recognize what you're seeing. That 1,000-yard stare may be the best indicator that the individual who's been impacted is not able to think and act as clearly as they might in normal circumstances. There may be an intense emotional reaction that officers often have to be on the receiving end of, whether it's screaming and yelling in anger or in upset. One of the first things that officers can do once they've established immediate safety and order, that in and of itself is having an enormous impact in turning the volume down on the traumatic overstimulation. The second is being able to recognize that both adults and children may not be able to think straight, and to be able to address the most immediate facts of what's occurring. Who's being arrested? Who's being taken to hospital? What will be the sequence of reports on the status of victim? Who is going to be responsible and coming to the family's aid to help them in their time of need, especially if one of the caregivers or both caregivers are not available to children? How do you actually ask children and listen to what their questions are? Amongst those many possibilities, the signal message is, we are not turning away from you. You are not alone. We are going to pay attention, and we are going to try to learn with you what it is you need the most right now, based on what we know about acute traumatic dysregulation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Marin. Let's go to another question here. Let's see here. Thank you all so much for sending your questions. And actually, I just submitted in the chat box, I just put the email address. I know several of you didn't hear it when I said it originally, that the email address was cev@theiacp.org, but I placed it in the chat box for you all to make sure that you had that, okay? All right, next question is, Chief, is there model policy for law enforcement agencies?
Yes, there is a model policy, and I believe you can obtain that through IACP as well.
And
okay.
Specifically, which the arrest policy?
There's children of arrested parents.
Yeah, there's children of arrested parents.
And there's some guidelines and tips on responding to children exposed
And there are
to violence.
guidelines and tips for responding to children exposed to violence.
Yes, absolutely. That is, yes, we do have a model policy center here, and we do have a model policy around that subject. All right. Let's see, we kind of touch base. I have some questions here popping up about how are we able to get the toolkit, which we mentioned to you already, just in the email. Let's see, do you address officer wellness, mental health in the toolkit? There were some questions about secondary trauma responses among officers.
No, we do not. But we do have stuff available for our police officers separate from the toolkit that we provide them at our department.
And I just wanted to add that, one of the things over working together for many years, one of the things that we've recognized can be such a tremendous source of secondary traumatization or distress for police officers is the same that's true for any of us as human beings. That if we remain helpless in the face of terror, then we are at greatest risk, and officers know this well, of going home at the end of the shift and feeling less effective, absorbing the horrors that one has seen others witness, and feeling that one has not been able to do anything that one would like to do in terms of decreasing the harm and damage experienced by the individuals to whom they're responding. So what we found anecdotally is that when officers feel better equipped, they are able to leave the scene of events to which they've responded, feeling as though they have met the needs of children and families as best as they possibly could, no longer leaving feeling ineffectual, as though they've not been able to either stop the criminal activity to which they're responding or to do anything for the victims of that criminal activity. So in short, what we're finding is that police officers who feel better equipped, who feel that they're able to actually step in when they're needed the most to help people get back on their feet psychologically, leads to a huge impact on how they feel at the end of the shift and how they feel as police professionals.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question we have, do you suggest getting parent buy-in for the resources?
I'm sorry, maybe you could help clarify the question?
Yeah, well, that's pretty much the question is, how do you suggest getting parent buy-in for the resources?
Absolutely, absolutely. You
Okay.
know, this is about really the function of the toolkit is to take advantage of pulling together observations that we've made over years, that colleagues both in policing and mental health have made over the years about traumatic response. But you know, the reality is every human being knows something about traumatic distress. And every human being knows what it's like. And there are many songs better than I could compose that have been written about, you know, there are times when we all need someone to lean on. And actually being able to inform adults, caregivers, about what's going on for themselves, what's going on for their kids, is a way not only of increasing buy-in, but increasing their knowledge and their tools for helping their own children. And being able to introduce what the police have to offer, what clinicians might have to offer, means that they're better informed about their options so that they're in a better position to not feel helpless in dealing with the traumatic impact of events on the lives of their children and on themselves.
Thank you. Okay, our next question we have, and thank you guys again, you guys are sending some great questions our way. Let's see here. Our next question we have is, all right, how do you handle sharing information regarding children with schools and child protective services in a prompt manner?
It's a great question. You know, first of all, in our partnership, as is in any intervention or collaboration like this, this goes back to the previous question. We don't share information, with one exception, we don't share information without caregivers' permission. And this is part of the buy-in. This is not just talking about treating people with respect, it's acting with respect. And so when we talk about being in touch with anyone outside of the family about children, it's for the purposes of helping parents take care of their children. The only exception is when, as mandated reporters, where the children's safety is at risk because of circumstances to which we've become aware. But our work and the work of police officers is to be able to be seen by the community, by caregivers, by kids, as being there for them, which includes being able to engage them in thinking about bringing everyone who can have an impact on children's recovery to the table. But that's with the authority and permission of the people who matter most in children's lives, which are parents and the children's caregivers.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, next question. Do you do any primary aggressor evaluation at the scene?
Yeah, we do. We actually, once we get to the scene and we identify the problems and we separate folks, we do a history on both individuals involved or anyone that's involved in the household to understand their past. So yeah, we do a history on the individuals involved.
And just to add to that, when we're working together, and this is something that law enforcement professionals actually know a great deal about, which is there are some people, which goes back to knowing about the primary aggressor, there are some people where, you know, the traditional methods within the criminal justice system need to be utilized better with a better understanding of when external controls are in fact useful not only to potential victims, but to aggressors themselves. And so in our work together, we always want to think about what the history of the primary aggressor is in terms of patterns of behavior, as well as thinking about any remedies that can enhance the safety of potential and existing victims. And in the training that we do that accompanies toolkits for those departments who are interested, so one-day training that are co-led by master trainers from the policing and the clinical side, we go into some detail about how to think about a range of interventions that actually become a combination of police, criminal justice interventions alongside of mental health interventions.
All right. We have a question here that says, here in Maryland, we are developing a curriculum to train law enforcement surrounding issues to address the opioid epidemic. And what are the challenges you have faced with the culture of law enforcement and integrating trauma-informed policing?
Sorry. Thinking about the introducing trauma-informed policing and the culture of policing.
I'm still not clear on the question.
You guys need me to repeat it?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. All right, so we had someone to submit a question that said, here in Maryland, we are developing a curriculum to train law enforcement surrounding issues to address the opioid epidemic. The question is, what are the challenges you have faced with the culture of law enforcement and integrating trauma-informed policing?
In general around, yeah, trauma, that's a great question.
Okay, so you know, when you introduce something to police officers, it's sometimes difficult, right? You got to get buy-in. When I first started in law enforcement, I started and I wanted to run and gun. Basically, you wanted to arrest people and you wanted to go after the guns and drug dealers. And it's not until you change not just the mindset, you have to change the heart set of police officers and get them to understand, what did I sign up for? What was, when I signed up to become a police officer, I signed up to help people, right? Running and gunning, going after drugs and guns really doesn't help anyone. When you can change the trajectory of someone's life, and when you can leave a scene fulfilled and accomplished as a police officer, that's helping people. So when you get the police officer to change their heart set, you get them to buy into to helping kids and helping people that are addicted to opioids as well.
And the only thing I would add is that, you know, I think what Chief Casanova is referring to is an expanded definition of protecting and serving, so that arrests will always be a part and a central part of policing as our investigations lead to arrests. But I also think that the question of what's in it for me is important for anyone who's doing any job. And I think what's in it for police is the satisfaction of feeling that they don't have to put blinders on to the suffering of the human beings, and particularly kids, to whom they're responding. And when they're equipped They don't have to put blinders on and, in fact, become heroes in real life on the scenes of terrible events that require a police presence. And by the way, from the clinical side, buy-in is also an issue. Can you imagine all of the stereotypes that uninformed civilians, and I'm talking about clinical civilians, have about police? Well, one of the reasons why our partnership has been so successful, because we've been able to learn from each other. And I think one of the most important take-homes for police officers is the critical role that they and only they can serve in the huge number of cases that without police recognition would never receive any help in the midst of traumatic dysregulation. The simple paying of attention to the fact that psychological and physiologic impact of events is part of what they're responding to, and that they have a role to begin the recovery process is an enormous source of satisfaction, as well as a significant way of putting a dent in the huge numbers of failures of recovery that have so often occurred in the wake of traditional policing and clinical services.
If I can add to that, I'd like to share a story with you early on in my career. I was a young police officer. I had gone through the Yale Child Study training, but I wasn't completely sold on the idea of employing this type of training in the community. I was dispatched to Yale New Haven Hospital for a child who was sexually assaulted. I'm going to give you a short version, because I know we don't have a lot of time. And it was the last court you wanted to go to as a police officer. I went there, and through the training, we ended up getting these cards on step-by-steps explaining what to do and how to engage our partners at the Yale Child Study. I included them in this claw, stayed in touch with the mother for a number of years. The kid was probably 5, 6 years old, and surprisingly, about 13 years later, I get a call from the mom who asked me to attend a celebration they were having for her son. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to go or not, but I made the decision to attend that graduation party, right? And when I got there, mom pulls me to the side and says, if it weren't for the work and because you cared and because you paid attention and because you put us on the right track, right, my kid would not be graduating today and going to a prestigious college, right? So when you hear that from a parent, the fulfillment and the duration of that job satisfaction lasts so much longer than when you arrest someone for a gun or drugs, you know. So the job satisfaction behind being able to change the trajectory of someone's life is immense.
All right. Chief, do you employ DCF on cases regarding a drug raid?
Do we employ DCF?
Yes, so the question is for the chief. Do you employ DCF on cases regarding a drug raid?
If there are children at a home for a drug raid, yeah, we're mandated reporters. We have to include DCF in that.
Okay. How many officers, this is another question for the chief, how many officers in your department are trained in this? All or just specialty units?
So, okay, so we've been doing this work for almost 30 years now, Steve?
26 years.
About 26 years. And many of our officers are experienced with the way we handle children exposed to violence, right? But we're currently in the process of training all of our officers in this toolkit.
Okay, which is great. Great. And at this time, everyone, you should, I have gotten several requests to repeat the information regarding the toolkit. I know some of our Intact folks have provided some information in the chat box for you all to how to download, but also remember the email address that was also submitted in the chat box, cev@viacp.org. All right, 2 more questions here. What is being done for bullying in schools? School districts are doing nothing despite their claims otherwise. That question that came in.
Well, you know that one of the advantages, and my police colleagues know this all too well, that you know there are two pressures. One is when the police are being called by schools to respond to everything and to solve all the problems within the school, which can be an awesome burden. And the other side is not being called when they need to. I think in our community, our police department is actually very well known for working for the community. And so when the police here are seen in New Haven and elsewhere around the country are seen as a resource. And so when there's an issue of bullying, even if a school is not responding in a way that a family would like, you know, community policing is about the community knowing their officers. And so being able to have a relationship, even when there's not been a police response, becomes an enormous resource. The other is that often police are called into situations where bullying may include potential threats, potential assaults, etc. And in this situation, it's an opportunity to actually engage with school officials, with parents, with kids, and with clinical colleagues in thinking about how to best advocate on behalf of a bullied child so that they are never alone as victims to what is inappropriate and damaging experiences in their development.
Okay. All right, a few more questions. Has this toolkit ever been used in other countries? If not, is this something you would recommend trying to adapt to other countries, particularly Latin American countries?
Yeah, well, we just had the honor and pleasure to travel to El Salvador, who, believe it or not, it's a country with many challenges, and they're also paying attention to what's happening with their children and early traumatic experiences, and they too wanted to address it, so they brought us there to present on the toolkit, and I believe they're translating it in Spanish currently, and they're going to train their officers on how to identify you know, trauma in kids.
And we're also working with colleagues in Israel and have had discussions with and have worked around the toolkit and similar partnership with colleagues in France, in all three countries where there's a national police force. We're working with those executives and line officers.
All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. Question came in. We have found that family law courts are really downplaying a child's exposure to domestic violence. National studies have shown that if a mother brings up allegations of domestic violence or sexual assault of a child, the courts are more likely to give additional custody to the abusive parent. Do you have any explanation for this national trend?
Wow, I'm disturbed if this is a national trend. I do think that given everything that we know about the dynamics of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, that what should be a trend is recognizing the trap that so many, typically women, find themselves in when they are the victims of domestic abuse, and the trap that their children find themselves in when there is no one who has their back. In the first instance, in the best of policing interventions, victims should know that someone is seeing them, their experiences, recognizes the short and long-term impact, and actually shows these victims, their children, that someone has their back. and that the violence needs to stop, and within the courts, the opportunity to put in place both ongoing sources of safety and security as well as resources, financial, housing, education, and mental health resources are available to help restabilize and reestablish control that every adult and every child needs from their parent.
Okay. And this will probably be our last question here is, do you have any resources for officers who have experienced secondary trauma from responding to such scenes? For example, do you have information on being a trauma-informed police department? And I think you touched on it just a little bit, but I think the question is really about resources for officers experiencing secondary trauma.
Yeah, I don't think through the years of doing this work, and Steve can actually add to this, we haven't really experienced a lot with officers experiencing secondary trauma. But in the rare cases that we identify that an officer has, we have peer support groups, we have EAP, we have a plethora of things in place to assist the officers when they're either secondary trauma or everyday work trauma. We have many resources in place to address that.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that with regard to cases involving kids who've been exposed to violence, again, the idea of being able to be effective as opposed to being on the spot, there for moments, and then taking home the images of terrified kids and their caregivers at the end of the shift, that is something that has decreased significantly in our department and other departments who are doing similar work. But as the Chief said, there are resources within the New Haven Police Department, and we know that the IACP have developed resources for addressing some of the issues. But secondary trauma is something that also one can recover from, and we believe that becoming more effective in the job of protecting and serving is one of the primary methods of decreasing the long-term impact of vicarious trauma and turning immediate upset into a plan for action and effectiveness.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Mr. Luis Casanova and Dr. Marin for your comments today, and I appreciate you all also for all of your questions. Should you have had a question today that did not go answered, because you all sent us plenty of questions, which we are so thankful for, please email us at cev@theiacp.org. We would absolutely respond to your questions, and then also we will likely send out a form with a lot of missed questions and answers to those so that everyone can have the answers to everything that was asked today. As I said, there were plenty of other questions that we didn't get to, and we apologize for that, but just due to time's sake, we want to be mindful of your time. So thank you all again for everything today, and I will turn it over to Intact to wrap us up.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and thank you again, Tiffany, and thank you to our presenters as well for a very lively and wonderful webinar today. Just a few housekeeping items that I wanted to depart you all with. Please note that you may contact Intact through the website displayed on this slide. You can stay up to date on the latest information by signing up for OJJDP Intact TTA listserv. Also, don't forget to check us out on Facebook at OJJDP TTA. You can also contact OJJDP via the help desk by following the contact information on this slide. And do you have a question or a TTA need? Please submit a request for TTA via the OJJDP's TTA 360 platform. You can reach it through the link displayed on this slide. Also, as a reminder to folks, the webinar is being recorded and will be archived on Intact's YouTube channel, where you can also view past webinars. For event and transcript and supporting materials, please contact OJJDP TTA Help Desk on the information on this slide. Please take a few moments to read this disclaimer. And lastly, we would appreciate if you could take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback evaluation. Thank you all again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.